We'll get started in about 3 or 4 minutes, so if you'd like some coffee or banana or donut holes, go ahead and grab them. Give folks a couple more minutes to get settled, but we should get started shortly. Friends, I'm going to go ahead and draw us together as it is about 9:15, which is when I had told folks we would be started. Let me start with a prayer like I did last week, just to sort of ground us and get us settled in this space. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Creator God, you bring us together once again to talk about what it means to be a people who follow you, particularly in the Anglican tradition and the Episcopal Church. Guide our hearts and our minds as we continue that conversation today. Open us up to new ways of thinking, to new ways of being, and to new ways of ordering our common life around you. Be with the people gathered in this room, those who join us virtually, that our minds may be expanded, our faith may be increased, that we can rejoin the world of people on fire with your love. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so welcome. Not bad. I was worried about how much attrition I was going to have between Class 1 and Class 2. There were a lot of people in Class 1, and folks were very complimentary. And I was like, wait till Class 2, because you can always judge by the people who don't come back for the second one. So thank you all for being here. I know some of you couldn't be here last week. And like I had said last week, I am recording all of these. They're being broadcast live to our church's Facebook page. And we also have something called a Boxcast channel And that's simply a website where you can go and watch all of our services or things like this, because there are a lot of people who don't have or don't use or don't like social media. And we've recently been retooling our website a little bit. And so if you go to our website, actually at the very top, there's a red button that says like, click here to watch live. You can send anybody to that site and hit that click here button, and that will take them to our Boxcast channel. And so we'll have basically it archives 90 days worth of stuff. And so we'll have every service, every adult formation, anything that we have recorded, it will be on that site for 90 days. And then of course it's also on our Facebook channel. So I mentioned last week my thinking about how to break this up was kind of to do it into 4 parts. We do history, we do polity, we do theology, and we do liturgy. And so last week we talked a little bit about the history, right? I covered like 1900 years, I think, in 45 minutes. It was a very quick overview. And I want to just recap that very briefly in some really broad strokes with the idea of what I talked about, which is the branch theory, right? I talked about the Great Schism, which happened in like 1054 maybe, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The Eastern Church now known as the Orthodox Church, the Western Church now known as the Roman Catholic Church, and how when they split, each of them excommunicated the other, right? And so the Orthodox Church believes that they're the church, and the Roman Catholic Church believes that they're the church, and the Anglican tradition says we're not the church, but we're part of it, right? And so we subscribe to what's called the kind of the branch theory of ecclesiology. We are a branch of the church, right? The one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The church in England was Roman Catholic up until Henry VIII. I talked a little bit about how that happened. It's not simply that he wanted a divorce and couldn't get it. That was part of it. But that was really part of a larger narrative of how the church was governed, right? The Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, had started exerting his power in foreign lands in a way that was a bit unprecedented, started appointing bishops in England that didn't live in England, didn't speak English, and so there was a lack of sort of representative authority. The reason the divorce of the annulment to Catherine of Aragon was not granted almost certainly was political, right? Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, and was the niece of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so it was a bad look. And remember also Catherine of Aragon was Henry's older brother's widow, right? So he married her after his brother died, when he became the heir apparent to the throne, again for political reasons. Realized they weren't having a male heir, thought his marriage was cursed by God because of the Levitical rules against marrying your brother's widow, applied for annulment, didn't get it, and said, why am I talking to the Bishop of Rome? I should be talking to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who did grant it. And so then the church splits, kind of Protestant under Henry. Henry's son, who's like 9 years old, goes full Protestant. Henry's daughter, Mary, Bloody Mary, takes it all the way back to Roman Catholicism. And then third child, Elizabeth I, kind of meets him in the middle with what's called the Via Media, the middle way between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. And then the Roman Empire blows up, right, and starts colonizing places. And so the Church of England goes out into the world, ends up here in America. We have a revolution and can really no longer be the Church of England since we're not part of England anymore, and establish the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. That's our official title. If you open up our prayer book, if you get bored, the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. That is our full title. And today I want to talk about how that church is structured. And I made the joke during announcements in there that you might not find that interesting. So think about it this way. What would you have to do to get me fired? Right? That's another way to think about it, right? What is the structure of our church? If you wanted to get rid of your rector, please don't. I really like it here. But if you wanted to get rid of your rector, how would you go about doing that, right? So hold on to that thought in your mind. So first, polity, right? Very fancy word. I think it comes from the Greek polos, meaning community or politic, right? And it's really just the operational or governance structure of the church. It's how we're organized, right? It's how we are set up. And the reason we have to do that is that we are human, right? The church is made of people. Whenever two or more people gather together, there is some sort of organization, be it formal or informal. And so the organization of the church in the Anglican Communion is fairly formal, right? Just as a singular body, right? The cells are organized in certain ways to get things done. Our church as a body, it's organized in certain ways to get things done. And there are different types of polity, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I just want to get your minds around what we're talking about here. So we have maybe the most well-known one is what's called congregational polity, and that means each church is its own thing, right? You get to do whatever you want, you get to believe whatever you want, you get to ordain whoever you want, right? And so most Baptist churches are congregational. If you go into New England, there's actually UCC churches, the United Congregational, right? They're congregational. They're part of a larger association, but it's individual parishes that make all of the decisions, right? And that's why in the Baptist tradition, you have churches who are super, I hate using left and right because it's so political, but you have churches who are super far on one end of the spectrum, and churches who are super far on the other end of the spectrum, right? You have churches who don't allow women to speak, and you have churches who ordain women, right? And they both call themselves Baptist. And the reason they're able to do that is because their polity, their structure is congregational, right? They get to make decisions on a congregational level. Then you have sort of the Presbyterian model, and I don't necessarily just mean the Presbyterian church, right? The Presbyterian model comes from the word presbytos, which is essentially priest. They are gathered in a somewhat similar way. A lot of their decision-making is on a congregational level, right? So in the Presbyterian church, you're still ordained to a specific congregation, right? You have to be called to a specific congregation. You go through divinity school, but you're ordained to a specific call, right? And they are led by elders. And so their decision-making body is bottom-up and top-down. Right? They're part of a presbyteriate, which does some of the rulemaking, but a lot of it's done in the individual parishes themselves. And then you have sort of on the other end of the spectrum, us, right, or Episcopal. And the Episcopal model comes from Episcopos, which means bishop, right? And so if you want to think pure Episcopal model, Roman Catholic Church, Greek Orthodox Church, that's pure Episcopal. And what I mean about pure Episcopal is it's all top down, right? The Bishop of Rome, right, who we call the Pope, or they call the Pope. The Bishop of Rome essentially is the top of the pyramid, right? The Patriarch of Constantinople is, I think that's right. I think the Patriarch of Constantinople is the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the bishops have all of the power. The bishops get to make all of the decisions. We're kind of in the Episcopal Church here right in the middle, right? We are sort of, we're Episcopal, but we're not only Episcopal, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And so I was asking my wife last night, before we went to sleep, I was like, all right, so should I go top down or bottom up? And she looked at me like, what are you talking about, and why does it matter? And the reason I was asking that question is that I think it's helpful to sort of locate where we are in the web of Anglicanism. So I'm going to start at the top with like the 30,000-foot view, and then I'm going to try to bear down a little bit, and I hope it makes sense, right? So when you're picturing my words, we're going to start here, and we're going to come down like this, okay? And when we get here, we should end on St. Andrews by the Sea, Episcopal Church in Naxton, North Carolina. So global Anglicanism. Anglicanism is literally just the Church of England, right? And whatever its iteration is. I mentioned in our topic, our session on history, that the Church of England was just in England until the British Empire expanded, and then it started going around the world. And so now you have the Church of England all over the world. And as England lost some of those empires, right, as those colonies became independent or free, the religion stayed, but they were no longer formally part of England. And so they became provinces within what we call the Anglican Communion. And what the Anglican Communion is exactly that. It's a communion. It's a community. It's a group of churches throughout the world that are connected by a couple of things. The primary thing we're connected by is the Archbishop of Canterbury. right? The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the Church of England and presides over the Anglican communion. He is what we call the primus inter pares, and that's Latin for the first among equals. And again, you'll notice that's different than the Roman Church, right? The Pope is not equal to the cardinals, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury is equal to all of the other bishops. He is the first among equals, but his power is seen as equal. And so what he does every 10 years is he convenes what's called the Lambeth Conference. Lambeth is the name of his palace, right? It must be nice. He has a big, beautiful palace in England, and he invites bishops there every 10 years. And this is kind of a crude explanation, but if your bishop is invited to the Lambeth Conference, then you're in the Anglican communion. That's really about as easy as it is to explain. Now, I mentioned last week that there is some gray area there, but every 10 years, he invites all of the worldwide Anglican bishops. They gather there, and they talk about theology, and they talk about the nature of the communion in the world, and they will sometimes write some papers, and they will sometimes draft some resolutions, and they have almost zero authority over the Episcopal Church, or over any church outside of it, right? And that's different from other traditions, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why it's that way. But they get together, they can make recommendations, and they can make statements, but they can't really do anything that's binding to provincial members of the Anglican communion. And that's because they don't understand themselves to have that kind of authority, right? If you remember why the Anglican Church, the church in England, became the Church of England, it was because there was this belief that one of the hallmarks of Anglicanism was local leadership, right? And so that's still evident in our decision-making practices, that the Archbishop of Canterbury can't tell Bishop Rob Skirving, right, how to run his diocese, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury isn't going to call me and say, you really need to do it differently. However, if he did, I probably would. But he's not going to do that, right? Because we have a little more autonomy. And so you get to Lambeth Conference every 10 years. You offer guidance, but you don't make doctrinal decisions. And the people that go to that, I said, are bishops, right? All of the bishops from the world. And so Bishop Skirving will be invited if he's still a bishop, right? Bishop Rodman and Bishop Hodges Koppel, who are bishops in the Diocese of North Carolina, will be invited. I don't know if retired bishops are invited or not, but I think under a certain age they are. So all bishops are together there. And those bishops come from what I mentioned were provinces, areas in the world that make up individual bodies themselves. The Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America is a province. Now, we are not just bound to the geography of the United States, right? I believe that Cuba is now part of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. There are some other Latin and South American countries that are part of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. We have what's called the Convocation of Churches in Europe, which are part of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. But by and large, we are here in America. We are a collection of dioceses, right? That's our fancy word for it. Dioceses in and around the U.S. and the world. Now, we don't have a primate, right? Or primate. A primate is the person who sits, well, we do, but we don't call him a primate. We call him what? Michael Curry is who? The presiding bishop, yeah. He's the presiding bishop. So that raises the question, what is he presiding? I heard us and everything, kind of. So technically, what makes him the presiding bishop is that he presides over General Convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. And so that's what makes him our presiding bishop, because he presides over our triennial meeting. It happens once every 3 years. I mentioned this last week. I promise it's hard to believe, but it's true. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church is the largest democratically elected body in the world. It governs one of the smallest denominations in the world, but it is the largest democratically elected body in the world because we believe that local representation is important. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and what that means. So General Convention comes together every few years, and it's made up of two houses, the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops, right? Now, if that sounds similar to our national government, you're paying attention, right? And that's not by accident. I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but it's going to mirror the political constructs in the United States. And so you have the House of Bishops, which include all bishops under 77 maybe, I don't know what the number is, but all bishops under a certain age, whether you are an active bishop or not, have a seat in the House of Bishops. And then there's the House of Deputies. The House of Deputies are elected at diocesan convention, right? And so every year the Diocese of East Carolina gets together, and there are representatives from our parish that go to that meeting, and I go to that meeting, and we elect delegates or deputies to send to General Convention. And so every diocese does this. And so you have two houses. And in order for things to pass, they have to pass both houses. Right? So if you want to change something in the Episcopal Church, in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, it has to go through General Convention, and it has to pass the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops. Again, very similar to our process. So the things that they deal with at convention primarily are liturgy and governance. Right? They don't really do doctrine. And that's an interesting thing. The way they do doctrine is by changing liturgy. And we'll talk about this when we talk about how we worship and what we believe. But if you want to change doctrine in the Episcopal Church, you change the way we worship. Because the way we worship expresses what we believe. Right? And I'll give you an example. Right? We have an ordination rite that has gender-neutral pronouns because we ordain men and women. That was a liturgical change that expressed a doctrinal shift, right? There is an approved liturgy. It's not part of our prayer book, but there's an approved liturgy for marriages of two people of the same gender. Again, that's not a doctrinal change. It's a liturgical change that expresses a doctrinal shift. There are dioceses and parishes that are super comfortable doing that, right? And so there's a liturgy you can use. So that's what the Episcopal that's what General Convention of the Episcopal Church can do. It can change liturgical functions. But it takes almost 10 years for that to happen, right? Because it has to pass once, and then it has to pass, usually what happens is they approve a trial, you go back 3 years later, so it's 6 years now, and then you approve an amendment, and then you go back 3 years after that to ratify. Right? So it takes 9 years, really, to effect a change. But that's how things like the prayer book are changed. That's how things like the hymnals are changed. That's how things like the official interpretations of Scripture, I say interpretations, translations of Scripture are changed, right? So the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible is the official translation used in the lectionary of the Episcopal Church. If we wanted to change that, we would do that at General Convention. And so that's what happens. They change those things. And again, I mentioned those are made up of people in dioceses. All right? Does this make sense? So we're starting here. We're Anglican Communion, General Convention. We're moving down to diocese. So a diocese is a regional grouping of parishes led by a bishop. Right? There is one bishop who's head of every diocese. Some dioceses have more than a bishop, but there's only one diocesan bishop. Right? The other bishops are usually called suffragans or coadjutors or co-adjudicators. I can't remember the name. But we have one bishop in the Diocese of East Carolina. His name is Robert Skirvin. He is the chief priest and the chief pastor in the Diocese of East Carolina. And so we get to elect our own bishop. And we do that at our diocesan convention. Right? And again, this is important. It's a local decision, right? In England, bishops are chosen by the Queen. In America, bishops are elected by diocesan conventions. And that's a big difference. And again, it reflects sort of our democratic history, right, politically. I mentioned last week that one of the things that the church historic had always done was make decisions in council. Right? We made decisions in bodies when we gathered together. And so the Diocesan Convention is one of those bodies. I also mentioned that there has been fallout before by certain decisions that have been made in the Episcopal Church. One I mentioned was the election of Bishop Robinson, of the Bishop of New Hampshire in 2003. Bishop Robinson was an out gay man. The Diocese of New Hampshire, at their diocesan convention, elected him to be bishop. In our church, there really is no way to stop that, right? Regardless of what you think of it. If somebody is elected according to the canons and constitutions of that diocese, they have the right to elect whomever they want. Right? We might disagree with it, right? But you have the right to elect whoever you want to elect. Now, the reason I mention that isn't because I disagree with it. By all accounts, Gene Robinson was elected properly and was a very good bishop to a lot of people, right? One of the reasons it caused such a stir is that it was seen by many as sort of a departure of the historic faith. But the other reason that made it even harder, I think, was that we elect bishops in a different way than other members in the Anglican community. Does that make sense? Right? So the people in the Diocese of East Carolina don't have any say over who's Bishop of New Hampshire. Just as the people in New Hampshire don't have any say over who's the bishop in the Diocese of East Carolina. Because we believe that we get to choose our bishop, and we believe that other people get to choose their bishops. Now, that is not the same everywhere in this world, right? In the Anglican communion. There are bishops who are appointed. There are bishops who are elected. I'm sure there are bishops who buy their way to office still, right? We are a corrupt people by nature. We are not a perfect institution. But I think that's a great specific example of why some of the decisions in the Episcopal Church are confusing for so many people, and why, even if certain people in the church disagree with other decisions, we try to respect those and live in such a way that we honor those decisions, because we believe those are decisions for them to make, right? If we don't want to elect somebody bishop in East Carolina, then we don't vote for them, right? Because nobody's going to, that's very American, right? Nobody's going to tell us what to do, right? That's the hallmark of who we think we are, right? That it's sort of like the taxation without representation, right? We're going to make our own decisions, for better or for worse. And so, in every diocese, we get to elect our bishop. And the reason we need a bishop is because there are orders of ministry, and only bishops can make new clergy. Right? I talked about this last week. Right? We ran into a problem when the Episcopal Church split from the Church of England because we didn't have a mechanism to make new priests. And the bishops of England were not going to consecrate clergy in the United States. And so we had to go to where? Does anybody remember? Scotland, yeah. We went to Scotland, right? And we got Samuel Seabury consecrated in the Scottish Episcopal Church. And then a few years later, we got Bishop White consecrated back in England, and they took out the part where you had to make an oath of loyalty to the crown, right? And so bishops make clergy, right? And then clergy serve in parishes. And so we have three orders, right? We have a bishop who makes clergy and who is the chief pastor of the diocese. We have priests who are ministers of the word and sacrament, right? And so when I was in seminary, somebody explained this, the priest can do the ABCs, right? We can absolve, we can bless, and we can consecrate, right? That's sort of our unique function. So after communion, when I pronounce the absolution, that's what a priest does. When I bless things like houses or stoles or scarves or the sacrament, right? That is a priestly function. When I consecrate elements, right? That's really what it is. When I consecrate elements, that is a priestly function, right? And so that is what I am set apart to do. Now, one of the ways I explain this, and I don't know if it's a perfect explanation, but I think it's important to at least talk about, is that we don't believe clergy are any better than anybody else, right? We come from a tradition that sort of historically has some clericalism, right? Where we hold clergy up on pedestals. Those pedestals are very shaky, and I will tell you we fall often. It's not a good setup. We believe that our priests are set apart to do specific things, right? In the same way that police officers are set apart to enforce laws. Firefighters are set apart to fight fires, right? This is maybe doctors and nurses are set apart to take care of people, right? Priests are set apart by the church to do these specific functions, and when we are trained in a particular way to do those things. It's not about being better or worse than, right? It's about being set apart to do something different from. And so we believe that that's sort of how the orders of ministry work. Then we have deacons. Deacons are considered ministers to the world, right? And so if you think about it, and I wish priests were also this, but in some sense, the priests are kind of the clergy inside of the church, and the deacons are the clergy outside of the church, right? The deacons are the ones who are often sent out into the community to do certain ministries. There is what's called a vocational diaconate, and so deacons almost always have a secular employment because their job is to be ministers, representatives of the church out into the world. They read the gospel in services, they set the table, and they pronounce the dismissal, right? So if you have a deacon, that's what you do. I'm curious, has St. Andrews ever had a deacon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes?
Grace.
Okay, yeah. And so that's usually, I would say that's often just a matter of timing and luck, right? Where somebody in your community feels called to the vocational diaconate and gets ordained, they can get assigned to a parish, right? And so if there was somebody living on the Outer Banks who went through the diaconal process and got ordained, then I would call the bishop and say, hey, bishop, I would love to have that deacon help serve at St. Andrews by the Sea. And they would be able to preach from time to time. They would serve on Sunday services. But for the most part, they would be non-stipendiary, right? They're not paid to do that work. They're reimbursed for some expenses, but that's not a form of employment. I will tell you that every bishop has been a priest, and every priest has been a deacon, right? So when I was first ordained, I was ordained a deacon. In the Episcopal Church, you have to be a deacon for at least 6 months before you're ordained to the priesthood. It's seen as part of the ordination process. Right? Yeah?
What would you classify or make a distinction of the deacon in the Catholic Church and the deacon in the Episcopal Church?
I don't. So this is based on what I am guessing. I don't know for sure. So the diaconate in the Episcopal Church is. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the distinction. I mean, gender is one of them, right? There are no female deacons in the Roman Catholic Church. Do we have any recovering Catholics that can answer this question? Oh, do you know the answer? Were you?
I have a friend who's a deacon.
I'll throw it back to you. You tell us, Bob.
I don't know all the differences
Okay.
because I don't know what a deacon in the Episcopal Church does. But my friend, he can do everything but consecrate.
Right.
He can do marriages. He
Mhm.
can go out and preach, which he does.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I found very curious when he first became a deacon was when you take your vow.
Mm-hmm.
He was married.
Yeah.
The deacons can be married.
Yes.
If, in fact, his wife passes away,
That's
he becomes celibate at that point.
Right. Well, it becomes unmarried. Yes. Yeah.
So we were talking about taxes and taxation stuff. Does any of these layers have the ability to tax churches under them? Or
Yes. That's a really good question. So, do they have the ability to tax? Yes, we have the ability to tax, but we have the good sense not to call it tax. So we do have the ability, or we do ask for money, and so and you think about it, kind of it all flows up, similar to the way that it does in our state, I guess. So we have a stewardship campaign every year, right? And we ask for members in this parish to help support the ministry of this church, which goes to things like paying bills, keeping the lights on, keeping the buildings in good order, supporting the ministries in the wider area, paying for clergy and for staff and musicians and things like that, and our preschool. And then the diocese has an ask, right? I can't remember, there's a name for it. I think we actually call it an assessment, which isn't that kind. But the diocesan assessment, I believe, is 10%, right? So every parish is assessed 10% to support the ministry of the diocese. And then each diocese is assessed by the national church. I don't believe there's a formal assessment from Canterbury, from the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I do believe provinces support the Anglican Communion. Now, there are also different ways to do it, right? So there are a number of larger endowed parishes who are part of what's called the Compass Rose Society. And I don't know what the number is, but those are parishes that give, we'll call it $10,000 a year to the Archbishop of Canterbury's fund, right, for the Anglican Communion. And so there is giving on that level. I mentioned last week, I think, that part of what goes into kind of the crazy politics of the Anglican Communion also is that that a lot of the churches that are the wealthiest are also the smallest, right? So the Episcopal Church is one of the wealthier provinces in the Anglican Communion, but we are one of the smaller ones, right? The Church of Canada, wealthy. Church of New Zealand, fairly wealthy, right? Churches in Africa, huge, right? There are more people worshiping in Uganda, more Anglicans worshiping in Uganda on a Sunday than there are in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand combined, right? One country. Because the Roman Empire, right? Roman Empire went to Africa, colonized, made a bunch of Anglicans, right? But it's also a very poor province. And so one of the tensions in the Anglican Communion is provinces that might be opposed to some of our progressivism need our money. Yeah, and it is kind of redistributed. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah, that's a good question. So my guess to your question, Bob, is that the functions of the deacon, the Episcopal Church, and the Roman Catholic Church sacramentally are probably very similar, right? You can't celebrate communion, you can't do blessings. My guess is that, and I don't know this for sure, but in the Episcopal Church, a deacon can do everything in the marriage except bless it, because deacons can't bless things, right? So there is a way to do it that makes it a legal binding marriage, but it doesn't have the official blessing yet. You come back and get that. All right, so far so good? We're moving right along. All right, so now we're going to talk about the parish structure. And this is where we get to the St. Andrews by the Sea. So we're part of a larger diocese, right? But we are our own organization here. The parish is where we come together to work, we come together to worship, and we come together to build up the kingdom of God sort of on the ground level. Every parish has members. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a member at St. Andrews by the Sea. And this is a pretty, perhaps, unintuitive definition, but in order to be a member of St. Andrews by the Sea, your baptism has to be recorded here at this parish. That's really it. Your baptism is recorded at the parish. And that happens one of three ways, right? Either you're baptized here, and we put it in our books, or you are confirmed here, or received here by the bishop, in which case it gets put in our books during that process, or you transfer your membership from another parish. And in the paperwork from that parish, the records of your baptism will be sent here, right? And so that's what makes you a member, is that your baptism is recorded. And again, if you think about the politics, the governance of our church, the reason that's important is because we make decisions on a local level, right? And so you make decisions where you are a member, right? And so if you come to St. Andrews by the Sea, but you aren't a member, then technically you don't get to make decisions, right? Technically, in order to make decisions in your parish, you have to be on the rolls. And the way you get on the rolls is by transferring your baptism. It's similar to priests, right? So every priest is under the authority of a bishop, right? And you can only vote, be part of the decision-making process in the diocese under which you're in supervision, wherever you are under supervision, right? And so when I moved from East Carolina when I moved from Kinston, North Carolina to Greensboro, for about the first 3 or 4 years, I was still resident in East Carolina, which meant I could go to convention, but I couldn't vote, right? I couldn't sit on any committees, right? I couldn't take part in the diocese because I was not a member of that diocese. When I moved from Greensboro back here, I immediately changed my canonical residency, because I was rector, right? But I can only vote in one diocese at a time, right? Because I'm a member here. And so there's no other requirement for membership, no age, no attendance, no things like that for membership. However, there is a distinction in membership. You have voting membership and non-voting membership, right? And so to be a member of the parish, you get your baptism recorded. You're in, right? To be a voting member of the parish, your baptism is recorded. You're 16 years old or older. You are confirmed. You have attended communion at least 3 times in the last year. And you are known to the rector, right? I don't always know how those are enforced, but that's the canonical definition, right? A voting member of the parish is baptism is recorded, 16 years old or older, confirmed, received communion at least 3 times in the last year, and is known to the rector. Now, again, you kind of peel away some of the ridiculousness of that, how it sounds. It's all about being active, right? It's all about, are you actually participating in the life of your parish? Because we don't want people who are not participating in the life of the parish to have decision-making powers in that parish, right? And so, you can look at it sort of like, again, the comparison to politics is not a bad one, right? Everybody, who is a citizen doesn't vote, right? But if you meet certain standards, you can vote. And everybody who meets those standards doesn't necessarily vote, right? Right? All can, some should, none must, right? Right? Everybody who meets these standards can vote. Not everybody who does meet those standards does vote, and there are some people who meet those standards who probably shouldn't. But that's how it's broken down. And so what do we vote for here? What are the things we vote for here at the parish? We vote for a vestry, right? And that's important because, again, we're representative democracy, right? So we vote for a vestry here in, I missed something somewhere. We vote for a vestry here in St. Andrews by the Sea. It's, I believe, 12 people, right? And they serve a 3-year term. And each class, and they're broken down into 3 classes, right? So in any given year, we should have 4 people rolling off the vestry, right? So every 3 years, or every year rather, 4 people roll off the vestry, and we elect 4 more, and they serve a 3-year term. And the vestry is given a lot of power in the Episcopal Church, right? So what does the vestry do? You guys know? Manage the budget, right? So the primary role canonically is fiduciary, right? So they manage the budget, they manage the buildings, right? They have all of the fiduciary oversight, and so they are the people who make decisions about whether we want to, how we want to spend our money, essentially, right? And what we do with the money that we raise. They help make decisions about how we keep buildings up and things like that. They also have the responsibility of calling a rector, right? You all just went through this process and you had a search committee, right? The search committee does not call a rector, right? The search committee does the work for the vestry, but technically and canonically, the vestry calls the rector. And so what happens in our process was the search committee, right? The vestry delegated the search to the committee, right, who whittled it down, interviewed, selected one candidate to present to the vestry, and the vestry is the one who calls them, right? And so I got a call from David, our senior warden, making the job offer, because that's how it works. The vestry, who's elected by the people, call a new rector, right? And again, so those are the powers of the vestry. And in the vestry, there are certain roles. You've got the senior warden, you have the junior warden, you've got a clerk, and you've got a treasurer, right? So the senior warden is, and again, this is not super precise language, but the senior warden works closely with the rector. The junior warden is often viewed as the people's warden, right? It represents the needs and the views of the congregation. And I don't know if this is actually enshrined anywhere in canon, but traditionally the junior warden is also the one who takes responsibility for the the upkeep of the physical plant, right? And so the junior warden traditionally is the one who, calls pest control when we find rat droppings, or coordinates with our bookkeeper to make sure that the fire station comes and checks our fire extinguishers and things like that. Then we have a clerk of vestry who records all of the actions of the vestry, right? Every month there are minutes of the previous month's meeting stapled to a brand new looking bulletin board out there that we just redid this last week that tells the actions of the vestry. And then there's a treasurer, and the treasurer keeps the books, right? Now, the treasurer and the clerk do not have to be members of the vestry. One of them is right now. Teresa Osborne is our treasurer. She also happens to be an elected member of the vestry. Claudette is our clerk. Claudette is not a member of the vestry, but she is elected, or she's elected the clerk by the vestry. How long have you been our clerk, Claudette? Forever, right? Yeah. She does a meticulous job, and it's often a thankless job. We've got a few more minutes here. And so that's kind of the role of the vestry. And then you have the rector, right? And the rector in the Episcopal Church is vested with a lot of authority, right? So canonically, the rector can choose who gets to use the building, when the building's open and when it's not open, when worship will be, what worship will look like. The rector hires, manages, and fires staff. The rector represents the parish for clergy matters on the diocese, and the rector works with the vestry. Now, I will tell you this, a smart rector works with the vestry in decision-making for the parish, right? Canonically, sure, the rector can do a lot of things, but a smart rector is not going to just make crazy decisions like that. Canonically, I could say, I want to hire an associate rector whose job is to wash my car, right? What can the vestry do to keep that in check?
Not pay.
Say that again, Edith?
Not pay.
Not pay them, right? Yeah, sure. If I can get somebody to do it for free, I can call them, right? I can hire people, but the vestry can be like, yeah, that's not a good idea. We're not going to pay them to do that job, right? So all of the salaries, all of the benefits are approved by the vestry because they're in the budget of the church, right? And so you see this checks and balances, right? If you wanted to, this is again a little crude, if you wanted to compare, the rector has a lot of executive authority, right? The vestry has legislative authority, right? I can decide things, but if the vestry doesn't support it, it's not going to go well, right? I can decide things, but if the vestry doesn't support it, I'm out of luck, right? It's not going to work. Similarly, and this is the question you guys have been hanging on to, how do you fire me? No. Did you say carefully? Yeah. You don't. And again, I hope you don't. The canons of the church are such that when a rector is elected, right, by the vestry, chosen by the vestry, it's an open-ended tenure, right? Unless I do something illegal or immoral, I can't be removed. Now, there's some we can have some conversation. I hope it never gets to that. There is some conversation about that. But canonically, technically, a rector can never be fired and can never quit. Right? I can leave I can receive a new call and accept it, or I can retire, or I can go on disability. But technically, I can't just quit. Right? And I can't be fired. Now, if it got to the point where the vestry of St. Andrew's by the Sea said, Nathan, we don't want you here anymore, they can't fire me, but what can they do? Yeah. I'm glad you laughed when you said that. Thank you. Edith said not pay me. Right? Yeah. They could stop paying me. Right? I would still
leave on your own accord.
Right. Yeah. They could stop paying me. Now, I could still keep my keys and preach my sermons. Right? What? I could still keep my keys, right? And I could still preach sermons, and I could still make all of the decisions and director can make, and y'all can stop paying, right? And that's usually a quick way to get somebody to leave, right? And so again, it's not all black and white. Technically, now if I were to do something immoral, right, I can be disciplined by my bishop, right? I can be defrocked, or I can be suspended. The bishop can say, I can be what's called inhibited, right, which means I'm no longer allowed to practice my ministry anymore. If we came to a place where the vestry and the rector were at an impasse, we could call the bishop in, right, and ask for some mediation, right? And this has happened, right? There have been times and places where a congregation said, listen, we can't go, we're at an impasse, we can't go on anymore, and the bishop will come in and try to help figure this out. There is a church I know of that had a rector who was there for decades, and the rector wouldn't leave. And when the vestry was, ready for them to leave, and the bishop was part of that conversation. And my understanding was that they basically came up with like an exit package, right? Where the vestry said, all right, we'll pay you to leave. We'll finish out paying you next year, or whatever it is, right? If you will retire or resign or whatever, because you can't quit, remember, right? And so they did. Yeah, I hear children yelling, and they sound like my children. But that's so that's how that is done, and it's sort of in consultation. And so again, I mentioned a little while ago, there are a lot of similarities to our structure and our governmental structure, and that's not a coincidence, right? The Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America was created in Philadelphia in I got it in my notes somewhere. It wasn't 76, but I like where you're thinking, yeah. 89, right, which is the same year as the Constitutional Convention, same place as the Constitutional Convention. Bishop White, William White, was the chaplain for the Constitutional Convention, right? One of the first bishops in our church. And so we were set up in a very similar way. Bicameral House at the General Convention, deputies and bishops, right? Local authority vested in local areas. You have legislative and executive branches, essentially, right, that work together for the common good of the group. And so it's very, very similar, right? And so that's how we make decisions, right? St. Andrews by the Sea can make decisions sort of within the sandbox that the diocese gives us, right? Here are our constitutions, here are our canons, right? We can decide that we want to, hire more clergy or not. We can decide that we want to expand certain ministries or not. We can decide that we only want to worship on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. and not on Sundays, and we could do that, right? We could decide, we decide how we do ministry here in the Outer Banks, right? We decide what outreach is important to us, and we decide what ministries to support, right? And we decide to invest in our preschool or in our music program, and we decide how we want to translate and live our faith here in the Outer Banks, and we have permission to do that. Just as the people in Clinton can decide what works for them in Clinton, and the people in Wilmington can decide what works for them in Wilmington, right? And we believe the people in Uganda can decide what works for them in Uganda, right? And that's part of the beauty of the Anglican Communion. We are a very big tent, right? People sometimes jokingly say, you can find somebody who believes something, you can find somebody who believes every belief in the Episcopal Church, right? You want hardcore Papist Marianism in the Anglican Communion? You got it, right? You want essentially like Unitarian Universalism in the Episcopal Church? There are places where you're going to find that, right? Maybe not expressly articulated, but we are a big, big place. And one of the beauties of that is that we believe that there is a place for everybody in the Episcopal Church, right? And that's not to say that St. Andrews is the place for everybody. Just as All Saints and Southern Shores is not the right place for everybody, right? Just as I don't know, St. Mary's in Kinston is not the right place for everybody. But we believe that you can find a home in the Episcopal Church because we are gracious and we are open to the Spirit. And we believe that in matters of unity, we should be on the same page, but on all other things, we practice grace. And so that's the story of our polity, and that's why we do it, right? It's rooted in who we think we are as people of God, right? It's rooted in how we understand our role in the community, and it's rooted in how we think authority works, right? We answer to our bishop, who is local, who lives in the Diocese of East Carolina, who works in the Diocese of East Carolina, right? And we make decisions that are in the best interest of our church and our community. We've got a couple of minutes if we want. It's only about 7 or 8 past 10. I'd like to be done by a quarter after, just so I can take a sip of water and change. But do you guys have any questions or observations? Yes, ma'am.
So why do we say Protestant Episcopalian Church? I mean, is it not redundant?
That is a good question. My guess is that so is that redundant? Technically, it's not redundant because, again, there are Episcopal churches that are not Protestant, right? The Roman Catholic Church is an Episcopal church. The Greek Orthodox Church and the Western Orthodox Church are Episcopal churches. All that means is that you are organized in a hierarchy consisting of bishops. Does that make sense? The Protestant piece is probably informed as much by Reformation language as anything else. But that's a good question. Yeah.
You mentioned that at diocesan convention, that's where people are elected to go to the
General convention.
How are people elected to go to the diocesan?
That's a good question, and it was probably in my notes somewhere, but I overlooked. The question is, how are people elected to go to diocesan convention? I have seen it vary in different churches. The way it was done in my last parish and the way it's done here is that nominations are given to the vestry, and the vestry selects the deputies for diocesan convention. I have been in a parish where it was opened up to the entire parish to make that decision, and the parish could vote for it, but the vestry is tasked with ultimately voting for representatives to the convention. That's a good question. Yeah?
The origin of the term rector and why it seems all the persons that since I've been in this church, they are referred to when they're introduced or when somebody addresses them as father as opposed to rector.
Okay. So where does the term rector come from? I'd have to Google it. Yeah. I will tell you that it's not just an ecclesial term, right? That there are still secular offices that are rectors. The College of William and Mary, for example, has a rector who I think is like essentially the chancellor. They call it rector. And so I would have to look into the etymology of it. The question about every rector is referred to as father. So I'm trying to think how to explain this. So you were a physician, right? By training? So you're a doctor, right? But you were not necessarily the chief medical officer of the hospital, right? And so rector is a position, father is the title, right? So and again, it's just kind of, so every male priest in the Episcopal Church could be referred to as father, right? But not every clergy is the rector of the church. So the rector is kind of the position, the father part is just kind of the title or the address.
Are the heads of every church in the Episcopal Church referred to as rector?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, Bruce.
So what's the difference between a rector and a vicar?
So it depends how it's used. So there are two ways I've heard it used. A vicar is, in the Episcopal Church in America, a vicar is usually a representative of the bishop, so is in charge, but doesn't have the same authority as a rector. Oftentimes in the Episcopal Church, that has to do with the status of the worshiping community, right? So there are what are called mission churches, and mission churches are below a certain size or not able to give the assessment, and so their clergy are assigned by the bishop, right? Not voted on by the vestry. And so that's the most common usage in America, is when you are vicar, what that denotes is that you are the chief clergy of that parish, but you don't have all of the same powers that a rector does because you were not elected by a vestry, right? So you were placed there or appointed there by a bishop. There are some really, really, really large churches in the Episcopal Church that have have a vicar, and that is usually synonymous with like a chief of staff, right? So Christ Church in Charlotte, for instance, 6,000 person parish, they've got something like 8 priests on staff, and they have a rector, right, who's like the CEO, but they have a vicar who handles kind of day-to-day operations. I don't remember the name of the big church in Richmond, the big Episcopal church in Richmond, but they just appointed one of their associates vicar. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Sorry, so to piggyback on that, priests and rectors are technically the same?
No. So I am a priest no matter what I am doing, unless the bishop makes me not a priest anymore. Right? So once I am ordained, I am a priest in the church. Right? Now I have been a priest. I have worked in a school as a chaplain, and I was still a priest. Right? There are priests who work secular jobs as doctors or lawyers or professors who are still priests. And so a priest is just one of the orders of ministry, bishop, priest, and deacon, right? So a priest is just a person who has been ordained to officiate the word and sacraments of the church. A rector is a job title. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I could leave here for a different job and not be a rector anymore, right? I could leave here and go be on a diocesan staff, or go work at a cathedral, or go be an associate somewhere else. And I would still be a priest, but I don't want to be a rector anymore, right? So a rector is basically a job title. Yeah. Yeah.
Canons, is that diocesan or is it national, or what are the canons?
So canons, C-A-N-O-N, not the things that go boom. A canon is again, I don't know the official definition, but a canon is basically a clergy. No, that's not true. You don't even have to be a clergy person. So diocesan staff are often canons, and cathedral staff are often referred to as canons. And I don't know what the etymology is there either, but they are basically administrative and ministerial assistants. And so you can have them on the national church. You can have them for diocesan life, right? So we have a canon. So in the Diocese of North Carolina, there's Canon Catherine Massey, who is our deployment officer. So she is basically kind of like head of HR. She deals with all clergy kind of exiting and coming in. She's not a priest, but she's still Canon Catherine Massey.
I was thinking more along the lines of canons in terms of the rules.
Ooh, okay. So the canons is law. So the canons just means law, right? And so the canons of the church are like our bylaws, right? We just call them canons, right? So we have two things. We have Constitution, we have canons. The canons are the rules. Yeah. And so so individual parishes don't have canons, but every diocese has canons, and the national church has a canon. And when those two things are in conflict, the national canons win.
Okay.
Yes?
Go back to that other canon.
Yeah.
Do we have different types of canons? Like, what is canon to the ordinary?
Canon to the ordinary means you're the right hand to the bishop. Yeah. So the bishop is the ordinary. Yeah. Not to be confused with just ordinary.
And are there other canons?
So you can have canon for deployment. You can have canon for mission. You can have canon for campus ministry. Yeah. You can have regional canons, who are just clergy who oversee specific regions within dioceses. Yeah. Does that make sense? What else you got? Those are good questions. Yes, ma'am.
House of deputies, are those lay people?
Yes. So those are all, House of Deputies are all lay people. Yeah. And again, so At General Convention, there's I don't know if they're called the House of Clergy, but there's the order, the clergy order and the lay order, right? And you vote the same way. And that's the same with diocesan convention, right? So all of our delegates are lay people, right? I'm the only priest from St. Andrews who goes to convention, right? But we send 4? 3, we send 3 and an alternate to convention. And it's based on size, right? Again, you get this representative democracy. The larger your parish, the more delegates you get, right? The larger your diocese, the more delegates you get to national convention or general convention. Does that make sense? Yeah. Other questions?
You've got to get ready for church.
They're not going to start with that one. I hope. Actually, I have worked with organists who are like, whatever. And so I want your input on this. So the last 2 sessions we're going to do are theology and liturgy. Which one do you think comes first?
Theology.
You want theology? Okay. Because here's what I'm going to argue, right? What?
It should.
It should come. Well, here's what I'm going to argue is that, the way you know our theology is through our liturgy. And so I don't think there's necessarily a right way to do it. But so next week we're going to do theology. And so here's what I'm going to ask of you. Next week, if you have a prayer book, if you would bring one, because we're going to look toward the back of the prayer book at the catechism. And so Cola last week asked for homework. So you can blame him. Cola last week asked for homework. I know. This isn't mandatory homework, but if you want some extra credit homework, I invite you to look in the back of the prayer book at what's called the catechism. And they're laid out as questions and answers. What is the Holy Spirit, right? Why do we pray? What are the types of prayers? What are the sacraments? What are sacramentals? What is baptism? What is confirmation? It will answer all of those things. That's what I'm going to use as the jumping off point for our conversation next week. All right? All right. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.